Hello and welcome to the 20th episode of the Bamboo Chalupa Digital Marketing Podcast. As always, I am your host, Brett Snyder, the owner of Knucklepuck, and I'm joined by my co-host, Nate Shiver, the author of ShiverWeb.com.
Howdy.
So, in previous episodes, we've talked about how search engines are designed to essentially emulate human behavior. You know, their goal is to present results that are catered to the specific wants and needs of their target audience, tied to the search query that they use when they visit the search engine in the first place. You know, we've also talked about how the best SEO strategies focus on those same wants and needs of those same users. You know, by serving the users in the same way that search engines do, we're actually working in parallel with the search engine that we are optimizing for and improving our ranking potential in those results. But how do we identify those wants and needs? You know, today what we want to talk about is we want to talk about a concept called persona development. And we want to talk about developing the right personas that are aligned with your overall digital marketing goals.
As far as defining what personas are, I think a lot of people have heard of it. And I'm not going to try to reinvent the wheel. Instead, I'm going to pull a quote from Mike King's really definitive piece on developing personas for digital marketing that we'll link to in the show notes. But he defines it as, and this is a quote, one of the main reasons for using personas is that when you target everyone, you're actually targeting no one. So the art of segmentation is about narrowing your focus in on people in the market more likely to buy or become your users and customers so that you can better serve them. And keep in mind, this applies not only to your product and or service, but your content as well.
You know, and to kind of distill that down to almost even a simpler concept, we can actually look at Disney Pixar's The Incredibles. You know, one of the main points that that the villain makes, that he wants to, take away this incredible nature of the superheroes, is that when everyone's incredible, then no one is. You know, from a marketing perspective, when everyone's a prospect, no one is. When everyone's a potential lead, then no one is. You know, a guy by the name of Jim Gray wrote a great post recently that was entitled, "You don't have a customer when you don't have non-customers." You know, people choose, and he goes on to say that people choose a vague customer target because they're afraid to confront their intended customers. You know, really what we want to get down to, to the heart of the matter here with our personas is that we have to understand very, very specifically who our audience is, what motivates them to take some sort of conversion action, however we define that. You know, Nate alluded to kind of Mike's point where it's not necessarily just about your product or service, but your content as well. Everything that we want to do from a marketing perspective should be catered to the specific wants and needs of our end users, and that's where these personas become extremely valuable.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to me, and I think one of the key takeaways I want everyone to take away from this episode is that personas, they don't just speak for themselves at, a high level, what kind of business are we, who's our broad target market. But I think personas are really going to come in actual nitty gritty everyday marketing, because defining specific personas, the exact target person that you're selling to helps you prioritize your marketing. It helps dictate what specific features you're going to need, what benefits you try to highlight within those features, and also the kind of language that you use on your website, in addition to defining, broad strategy.
And it allows you to be more efficient with your resources. You know, we've something that Nate and I have mentioned almost every single episode here is that we want to develop our strategy around concrete goals and then have benchmarks to ensure that we're aligning with those goals. You know, we want to learn who our audience really is so that we can present a solution that speaks directly to them. We don't want to be wasting resources going after what maybe would be, lookalike audiences, to kind of use a Facebook term that Nate and I have been considering for future podcast episodes. We're not looking for people who are like our target audience. We're not looking for people who have overlapping wants and needs with our target audience. We're looking to very specifically define what it is that drives our potential target audience to convert based on our product or service, based on reading or sharing a blog post or another piece of content marketing. We want to know exactly what it is that would motivate somebody to take the conversion action that we want them to take.
Yeah, what's cool about having personas in place that you can use in your everyday marketing is that it also allows you to do, the process of validated learning much more quickly. Because in a way, I kind of think of personas as almost like a hypothesis, that you're taking this hypothesis and you're going out and you're testing it. And you're testing it every single day because, again, just like you said, you don't want to invest time and resources into marketing for people who are not, they're never going to be interested in your product or service. There's a principle that we've also mentioned on previous episodes, the 80-20 principle that says that 20% of your customer base will provide 80% of your profit. And again, this is a general principle that applies in every industry, every business, and in many cases, many walks of life. And it makes sense to test and dive into really understanding that 20%, that 20% of people and defining who those people are that truly matter so that you can spend more resources there and not on the 80% of people who technically you sell to, but they're really not the key customers that you matter to.
And I think this is an important kind of distinction that I want to call out here, because a lot of times people will hear personas and say, well, I don't want to ignore the other 80%. And the nice thing about personas is that they're not mutually exclusive. It's really one of the nice things about SEO. By targeting a specific persona or a hyper-specific subset or segment of your market, doesn't necessarily mean that you're excluding the other pieces of your audience. It just means that we want to aim for that bullseye. Now, if we still hit the board, then that's great. Maybe they're not our ideal customer. Maybe they're not going to have the same, the fullest lifetime value of the customer that some of these other alternatives might be. But by focusing in on that 20%, focusing in on who are going to be the true primary drivers of growth for your business, we are going to have some residual benefit in terms of the way that we market to these specific groups. There will be overlapping wants and needs for people who maybe say, all right, in this particular instance, yeah, I am willing to convert. But what we want to do with our personas is to make sure that we are devoting, as kind of to the opposite of Nate's point here, that we want to devote 80% of our time to those 20% of the customers. We want to be able to focus in on the people who are going to drive that engine of growth, which is another kind of phrase that Eric Ries uses in the Lean Startup, which is where, as regular listeners will remember, where we got the validated learning concept. But what we want to do here is we don't want to say we're going to ignore anybody that doesn't check every box on our persona list. But by having a very specific understanding of who we're trying to target and what motivates them to take an action, we are able to go and be able to develop strategies around that target market where those strategies will still have some sort of residual impact on related audience segments.
And so just let's go ahead and dive into how we go about developing personas and how I think we can go beyond best practices to find personas that we can actually apply day in and day out. So, the typical persona is, it's a piece of paper with someone's name, someone's picture, and you outline, their age. This is Bill. He's 49. He's a contractor. This is what he encounters every day. This is some of his problems. This is where he lives. And it's basically building out a full story of an actual persona, an archetype of a target customer that you can refer to. And again, this can be on a piece of paper, Excel, whatever. But again, it's going to be a archetype of a typical customer. And before we dive into, all the different techniques that we use to figure out who this is, I think it's important to understand some of the caveats and how this works. If you actually go to Google's ad settings, if you're signed into Google, you can actually see where Google tries to place you into a persona or a customer archetype. And when you go there, you'll see that even the archetypes and personas that Google develops are never pinpoint accurate. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that We're not trying to be accurate for accuracy's sake. The point is to go after how you perceive your target customer, how you can find them, and then also understand how they perceive your website and your business, and how we can make those perceptions match each other in developing this Word doc, whatever format you end up having it in.
And I think that second part, Nate, is really the kind of the bread and butter here. We want to know how we define our target audience, but we also want to allow the target audience to essentially define themselves. We want to know who the wants, the needs, the motivating factors are, and say, we don't want to try to put our audience to fit within that box. We want to understand the box and then say who would naturally walk into that box on their own. And that's what personas are doing. It's not telling us that we're starting to say, hey, we're only going to target males over the age of 40 with a median income of $90,000 that live in the Midwest. We want to be able to say that the product that we sell, typically, it's largely, skis, for example. We're not going to be selling skis to our 49-year-old Midwesterner. We want to be able to sell skis to people who are realistically going to be interested in purchasing them. And by finding personas and being able to know exactly what those criteria are, it allows us to be able to be very strategic in the way that we speak to them.
All right, well, let's cover some of the methods that we like to use, because again, our goal isn't to brainstorm who we would like to sell to, but to actually find out who is going to be most interested and develop a accurate, data-driven persona around them. So the first one that I like to use, I call it the reverse engineer your best customer method. And so this is basically take your 10 most valuable customers, the customers that hopefully you already have. And if you don't have them, the customers that you think you would like to have, and get their email, drop their email into Facebook and go stalk them. Look at their profile, look at what they like, look at their demographics, look at their geographic area. Make a spreadsheet of all their common interests across these 10 different people, and look at the things that overlap. If you're trying to sell skis, if you see, all these people, they're also really into outdoor sports. They all live in either the Northeast or they live in California. Well, you'll start to build up sort of a aggregate picture of a customer that you can use to really drive and focus your marketing.
It's what makes Facebook's ad platform so fascinating, because of the kind of behavioral, demographic, and even psychographic ways that you can target specifically towards individuals. And that's why, when Nate talks about this reverse engineer model, the go-to is almost always Facebook, because people volunteer that information. That information is publicly available on their Facebook profile. Privacy settings notwithstanding, but this information, you're creating your own persona when you make a Facebook profile. This is the persona that I choose to present to the world. Now, my profile picture right now is a picture of me, but people will use Facebook and say, hey, their Facebook maybe is their newborn. Maybe it's their dog. It's the persona they choose to present. When we talk about this idea of personas, we don't want to just look at Facebook. We want to look at LinkedIn, anywhere that people are volunteering information about themselves. LinkedIn, from a B2B perspective, people will tell you how they define their role. If I want to say that my target is customer sales reps, I want to understand how customer sales reps refer to their own role. We want to read customer reviews for your product and your competitors. Find out what people like, what people don't like. Participate in the forums that are relevant to your niche. Really what we're trying to do here is we're trying to learn what the pain points are so that we can address them. People go to a search engine to solve a problem. That is the whole purpose of a search engine. Now, that problem might be I need more information. That problem might be I'm struggling with something. I need help. I need a product or service. But if we can understand the pain points that drive people to seek a solution, we are able to better present a solution that is going to directly impact those needs.
I love that. And the next method that I've got, that again, I use Facebook, but like Brett said, you can jump it off and you go look at Amazon, LinkedIn, all that. But I call it the reverse engineering your competition method. And again, this is something where you can basically pick a competitor, and it doesn't have to be a direct competitor. It can be a giant industry leader who happens to also play in your niche. If you're a plumbing business, you can look at Home Depot, that kind of thing. Or you can look at a complementary business. You just need something, a jumping off point. And again, you can head to Facebook, head to your platform of choice, wherever your audience is, and look and see at the people who are huge fans of the competitors or complementary businesses. What do they say? What do they like about those businesses? What do they dislike? And especially in Facebook, you can do different combinations of pages liked by people who like. There's all kind of cool ways that you can use it's called their Open Graph search, and we'll have a link to a tutorial in the show notes. And you can basically use Facebook and these different social platforms to let them tell you the types of likes and interests that come from competitors who, if they've been around, they've in a way done a lot of this work for you.
Right. And really the goal here is that we want to know what our audience has in common. What are those key traits that define our target so that our marketing speaks to those traits? And in reality, these personas are just a more nuanced way to speak the language of your audience. If we want to give a very obvious example, you wouldn't speak French to a Spanish-speaking person, even though they might be able to understand vaguely what you're saying. My wife is fluent in French, and we went on our honeymoon to Peru, and she could understand the Spanish because of their similarities in sentence structure and vocabulary, but she wasn't able to really, we weren't including her in any of the conversations because she couldn't speak the language. Now, that's pretty obvious to most people that don't speak French to a Spanish-speaking person, but you could speak Portuguese. Still a very different language, but there's a lot of overlap and it's much closer to somebody who might understand Spanish. That's where you start talking about just basic persona research. But what about Spanish in Mexico versus Puerto Rico versus Spain? What about Catalan versus Castilian? Most people approach personas just to speak not French rather than speaking the specific dialect that is going to align with that audience. We want to communicate directly using the language that they use and touch on the problems that they are presenting about themselves.
Yeah, and to go back to your skiing analogy, the people, if you're shopping for skis, the people shopping in the Dick's Sporting Goods or the Walmarts of the world are going to be talking and looking in a very different way than the people shopping at REI or Peter Glenn or a boutique ski shop in Aspen, Colorado, just to keep to our running example. But another method that doesn't rely directly on Facebook is the Google Display spying method. And this method, again, relies on the Google Display Network and requires a little bit of budget. Not much. We're just talking about like $10 to $20. And the idea here is that you pick a general profile of your persona. Just make an educated guess. Set a tiny budget in Google AdWords to run on their display network, which again, this is where they display banner ads or text ads throughout the internet. And what's really interesting, and again, this is something that actually Aaron Levy tipped us off to in our episode with him that you can find on babuchalupa.com. But it's basically to not try to get sales from these ads, but to use these ads to spy on where these people are visiting online. And so basically, if you dig into AdWords, you can see where all these ads are being displayed. And, the example that Aaron gave was that people who are building weddings, that are planning weddings, that you'll see that they're not just going to wedding sites and places to rent catering equipment and that type of thing, but they're also going to weather sites, like a lot. And that type of insight can give you an initial pain point and something additional that you can really get into their mind and understand what they're struggling with and build off your persona from there.
And it's great for understanding how these people make decisions. Where are they finding their information? Who do they trust? Who are considered the key influencers over this specific subset of your audience? By using the Google Display Network method that Nate's talking about here, is you can be able to see what influences that decision-making process. And if you go a step further, don't just look at the actual content that they land on. Look at the most popular content on these sites that are showing up consistently across your different tests. Once you identify a prominent source, you can reverse engineer how that source approaches content to build off of that. Personas are really just about competitive analysis. The tactics and the strategies are very similar to what you would do for a competitive analysis. It's just we have a much looser definition of that word competitor, where it's talking about anywhere online that presents information, which is, again, admittedly is extremely broad, but we're applying the same tactics to be able to understand what is it about this information, what is it about this site that is giving our users what they want. Because by knowing that, we know how to give them what they want.
And the next method, this is very similar to Facebook, but it was a method that I found by Jesse Quist over at Matrico Marketing. And it's basically the mining Twitter method. And this is a spin on the mining Facebook method. But the idea here, again, is to find a competitor or a complementary business, find their Twitter profile, and then go and stalk customers that are tweeting about them or tweeting to them, and to study their language. Because the interesting thing about Twitter is that, unlike Facebook, where, people just declare what their interests are. And of course, a lot of people are going to keep some things private. Facebook is going to keep some things private. With Twitter, everything is public. And with Twitter, you can see how people speak in real time and what really interests people, and what things about other businesses, competitors or complementary businesses, that people are willing to share publicly, and what are they willing to do to influence the people who follow them.
And you can see trends emerge over time. Because these conversations are taking place in real time, you can see how your audience reacts to new competitors, to new products, to new features. You're able to have real-time insights into that audience. And when we take all this information from this mining Twitter method, we can create a spreadsheet with those users. We can add in, more qualitative information, their wants, their needs, their hopes. We can enter in some more objective information, their language, where do they live? What is their age? Are they man or woman? Do they have kids? We can use all of this information and then apply filters to sort this data, and even consider something like a pivot table to visually analyze where these overlapping themes exist. We can also use tools like Follower Wonk to see where there are overlaps among your Twitter audience and identify gaps between your approach and the approach that some of your successful competitors may be taking.
Yeah, and the last method that we want to highlight is very near and dear to us because it revolves around keywords. And that's basically reverse engineering your persona with organic and PPC keyword data. It works best if you have a pre-existing site. So you can go into your Webmaster Tools or your AdWords account and pull all the keywords that have brought people to your site, in addition to, the landing pages or whatever analytics data that you have. And you take these keywords, landing pages, then just group them into themes based on the traditional marketing funnel, from awareness, research, consideration, purchase, and use the keywords and really look at the intent and the phrasing and how they're structured. Are they questions? Are they long tail, short tail, that type thing, to tell a story around a specific visitor? What was the initial pain point that brought them into your site? What was the type of term that brought them in where they ended up purchasing? And you take these keywords and you can group them, and you basically reverse engineer your persona, and you create a person and you say, this person, they're really research intensive. They start by looking for content to solve the problem themselves, and then they look at reviews and so on and so forth. And you can really use these keywords to build a narrative and tell a story around the specific visitor that you will want to pour more resources into targeting.
And if you don't have a site, as Nate mentioned, it's ideal when you can use legitimate data associated with your product or service. But if you don't have a site, consider tools to identify this information. Consider some of your more traditional keyword research tools where, understanding that keywords are that means to an end. Keywords are that language that the user punches into a search engine, and keywords are the terms that we want to be able to show for as SEOs. So if you don't have a site, consider some tools to be able to find that information. Look at a tool like SEMrush to find out where there are overlaps between what people are bidding on in PPC versus what is showing up organically for some of our competitors. Look at Google Trends to be able to find emerging keyword phrases or what is growing in popularity. Being able to try to anticipate how the industry is moving, and then more specifically using Google Trends to recognize what type of language is actually driving that innovation. Look at a tool like Ubersuggest and related queries in the search engines to see what else resonates with the audience. What I love about these tools is you already know that they searched for something. You already, in Ubersuggest, you know the root term that they're suggesting off of. On related terms, you know that they searched for something and these related phrases were popping up, alongside those. So by using kind of these keyword research tools, it's showing you what else they're looking for. It's broadening your understanding of how the user engages with the search engine so that, again, as we talked about at the introduction to this episode, that we want to make sure that we can align with that we want to run in parallel with what the search engine is trying to do in terms of serving these users.
All right. So we have tons of data that you can use to create a few target personas and really describe them in depth. But there's also a lot of mistakes that can be made along the way. And HubSpot actually created a really interesting blog post a while back that we'll link to in the show notes. That was just 6 mistakes when developing personas. And we wanted to run through these just because it was a really, really solid list overall. And the first mistake that they talk about is relying on anecdotal evidence from your team.
What this kind of comes down to is the fact that your opinion, more often than not, is irrelevant. We want to strive for an objective understanding of what our audience is interested in, not a subjective understanding of, I think this is what they're interested in, or this is what I thought when I started this business and it's why I created this product. Now, not to say that's not a good foundation, not to say that's not valuable information to consider, but we don't want to rely on this anecdotal evidence. We want to strive for objectivity. We don't want to make decisions based on subjective information that may vary from one person to the next. We don't want to say, I think the button should be red and not green because I like red better than green. We want to be able to say, I think that the red button looks better. Let's run an A/B test and see what the difference is in terms of actual clicks on this button. Nate has a fantastic kind of little case study talking about what happens when you change the color of your links. The color of your links, you change kind of the color to make them a little bit more apparent, and all of a sudden 40% increase in conversions on those links.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It was, I just used the default theme, which, it used the same font coloring for all the links instead of the typical, blue link or highlighted link that you see on most websites. Just switched it to what people are used to seeing. And all of a sudden saw a huge increase in people clicking through not only to my emails, but also clicking through within the site, off the site, just using them a lot more.
And this is not saying that, hey, the links maybe look a little funny. Nate went through and he tested that. He had some objective ways that he was able to evaluate what resonates most with that user.
Yeah, the second mistake that HubSpot lists is asking the wrong questions. So when you're developing these personas, it can get actually kind of fun in that you're developing this persona archetype, but it can also be easy to fall down a rabbit hole of completely irrelevant questions. Where do they go to school? How do they dress? Do they like yogurt? Do they like to travel? It's easy to build out to go into too many details.
Right. And so we want to know what questions that you want to ask going into it. Talk to your customer service staff. Talk to your sales representatives. Learn more about those existing customers, both what they like and what they don't. If you run something like live chat on your website, look at the live chat transcripts. There is a wealth of information that people are readily volunteering based on, kind of like we talked about, where with paid data, it makes more sense to look at your site. Live chat transcripts aren't questions people have asked about the product at large. They're talking about what they're asking about your specific product. Look at the internal search queries on your website. Identify these criteria that actually influence your buying decisions. And this is where you're going to learn what questions you need to ask to be able to develop the appropriate persona.
And third, HubSpot lists only talking to recent buyers.
And only talking to recent buyers lets you understand only what happened with recent buying decisions. Along the same lines, if you only talk to former buyers, make sure you're asking them questions about the future. How can we continue to serve you? What has kept you coming back? Which of the new features enhanced your experience with the product? Which features detracted from the experience? But we want to talk to recent buyers. We also want to talk to recurring buyers. We want to talk to people who maybe purchased and then decided to go somewhere else. Obviously these are, a lot of ways very difficult to be able to reach these folks. But just to give kind of an example, we've done this, on the agency perspective, where we talk to clients who have left, who have gone and pursued other agencies and said, well, what could we have done to serve you better? What drove you to leave? This gets us an understanding of their buying decision, but they bought from somebody else. So we don't want to just talk to the recent buyers. We want to talk to anybody who can provide insights in terms of that conversion funnel that Nate alluded to. We want to understand what that conversion funnel looks like with the highest degree of detail possible.
Right. And fourth, they say not talking to enough people is a big mistake. And I think they're mainly alluding to the idea of how personas are traditionally getting put together, which is, to sit down with a target customer, do a 30-minute interview, and then, take it from there. And in digital, keep in mind that there's ways around doing resource intensive or time intensive interviews with real customers face to face. There's tons of ways. In fact, we outlined several methods that you can use to get a bigger pool of people and develop data-driven personas.
Yeah, and remember, you don't have to talk to them directly. You could be a fly on the wall in these community forums. You can read reviews on yourself and your competitors. Perhaps another way to put this is that, you don't have to, not talking to enough people. Why don't we say that, one of the mistakes is not interacting with enough people. This could mean following social activity, looking at sites they visit through the Google Display Network method, any of the strategies that we talked about earlier, but we want to make sure that we have a complete understanding, that we are not artificially, narrowing our focus and missing key criteria that will actually be very influential in terms of developing the overall strategy.
And fifth, HubSpot lists letting your persona photo drive your insights. I think this is kind of repetitive of the first one, where we're just trying to get our anecdotal and personal opinions out of the way. So I think we'll just skip down to the sixth, which I think is most important.
And that has to do with creating too many buyer personas. And this goes back to our favorite Disney Pixar example. When everyone is incredible, no one is. Personas must drive action. And that action must be specific to the persona. This is almost like a dual verification in terms of whether or not your persona is valuable to you. But if you can apply the same strategy to multiple personas, then you have too many personas. Then it doesn't apply to this fact. We're not understanding specifically what that user is interested in. Your persona should have a very specific tactical action-based strategy that results from it. And if we have too many personas, we're starting to say, well, we can apply the same thing, but we're just going to say for men, it's also going to apply to women. Now we looked at people who like to ski, but also people who like to snowboard, but people who also like to just visit mountains. And then you kind of get down to this slippery slope where you start to create so many personas because, as Jim Gray mentioned, because you're afraid of confronting who your actual customer is, because that puts you in a position to fail to serve that customer. But we want to avoid having too many personas because that creates too broad, too generic of a strategy that doesn't really narrow in on what's really going to allow you to separate yourself from your competition.
Yeah, and I think that really goes back to what I think is the key takeaway for all this is that you have to actually use personas, because again, we're not trying to go through a formal corporate development exercise that we're just doing for the sake of doing. So developing personas doesn't mean just filling out a profile with fears, wants, needs, desires, but it means noting what type of content resonates. When you're developing blog posts, you should say, this is going to apply to this persona and this is why. You're going to think about what channels each persona uses. Where should you be spending your ad money? When you're talking about how they search, that should be directly integrated into your keyword strategy, to your PPC strategy. When you're outlining how your personas get information, that should be integrated straight into your content strategy. Again, all these things it's not something where we develop a profile for the sake of developing a profile. You're actually using it in the nitty gritty of all these everyday marketing activities.
And you should be able to defend your persona. You should be able to say, I've got data that supports the fact that this is my audience. I've got a strategy that I have developed out of this audience that I know is going to be able to touch on pain point A, B, and C. Because in the end, we want to create a profile or an archetype. I love that Nate gave that phrase earlier, but we want to create an archetype of our audience that we can use to influence our marketing decisions. We want to know what type of content they prefer. How do they choose to engage with the brands? Is it through social? Do they leave reviews? Do they write blog posts? We want to know what influences those buying decisions. Do they look more at features? Do they read reviews? Do they look at stats? Do they like free trials? Do they need screenshots and other visual elements? More than anything, we're trying to understand how they ascertain the value of a product so that when we're marketing our product, that we can highlight that value. And something that I kind of tie this back to is something that I try to use when I speak at conferences. And this was some advice that was given me years ago, but you don't start by solving a problem. You start by communicating what the problem is. Because until you have an intimate understanding of that problem, you can't provide a solution that speaks directly to it. Because it endears you to the audience when you understand their pain points. And it creates an association that your product is designed specifically for them. Your product isn't designed to make money. Your product isn't designed to give you a beach house in Cabo. Your product is designed to serve my need, to make my life easier. And when you can endear yourself to the audience in that way, you really put yourself in a position to be able to say that, yes, I am not just providing a general solution. I am providing a specific solution targeted directly to you. And this is why we've been able to maintain the same customers over years, because we know who you are, we know what you want, and we know how to solve your problems.
All right. Well, you can find previous episodes, links to all the awesome things that we mentioned in this episode, and our contact information at bamboochalupa.com. If you don't want to miss another episode, please go subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcasting app. And do leave us a comment and rating while you're there. We learn a lot from your feedback, and your ratings helps others discover the show. So for Brett Snyder, I am Nate Shiver. Thank you for listening.